Ani bonjour. Bonjour. Welcome, everyone. My name is Victoria Serta, and I'm delighted to be your host tonight for this virtual town hall meeting. First of all, we want to acknowledge the territories of the diverse First caretakers, known in English as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, of the land now known as Canada. And further, we give thanks to the traditional keepers of these lands and waters for sharing their land resources and knowledge with us. Before we hear from our speakers, let me start by explaining how a telephone hall works. Right now, voters right across Western Canada are answering their phones and connecting to this discussion. We will hear from David Merner shortly. After that, it will be your turn. You will have a chance to ask your questions. You can get in line to ask a question at any time by pressing *3 on your phone keypad. You'll then be put through to an operator who will take down your question and put you in line. We will also be asking you questions in the form of quick polls. When we read out a question and some multiple choice responses, you will be able to use your keypad to select an answer that best reflects you. Here are a few things to keep in mind when we raise your hand to ask a question. Number one, when you press *3 to ask your question, you'll be routed to an operator who will ask to provide your name and community. Number two, please try to keep your question as brief as possible. There are a lot of people on the line, and we want to try and get to as many of our questions as we can. Again, my name is Victoria, and I am excited to be your moderator for this virtual town hall meeting for the David Merner Leadership Campaign. My role is to keep this conversation moving smoothly as possible. Before we start getting to your questions, I would like to invite Judy Green to say a few words. Judy?
Thank you, Victoria. I just want to thank David very much for including me in this event. As you know, I have stepped down as a leadership contestant, and I am putting my full support behind David. I've had the opportunity, a unique opportunity, to get to know each of the leadership contestants, and I am fully in support of David becoming the new leader of the Green Party of Canada. He is a unifier. He is the person that we need at this point in time to get the results we need, and in fact the planet needs, for us to get Green Party members in Parliament. Thank you very much. David, on to you.
Thanks, Judy. I really appreciate your kind words, and thank you, Victoria, also for taking on the moderating tonight, and the whole team. There's a whole team in the background. I can see the questions coming in already, which is fantastic. More and more people are coming into the call. We can see that too. So welcome to everybody who's hearing us today. Thank you to everybody who's making this possible. Over to you, Victoria.
Thanks, David. For those of you just joining us, my name is Victoria, and I'm your host for this evening's virtual town hall meeting. Joining me today is David Merner, who is campaigning for the leadership of the Canadian Green Party. A virtual town hall is just like a radio talk show, except instead of you tuning into your radio, you have answered your phone when we called. Tonight, we are talking about who should lead the federal Green Party to victory in the next election. If you have a question for either of the speakers, please press *3 on your phone now to enter the queue. In addition to hearing questions directly from you, we have the ability on this virtual town hall to do quick polls. Let's do a quick poll now. I'm going to ask a question and then read out 3 potential answers, and you choose the one that most reflects your opinion by pressing the number on your phone keypad that corresponds with your answer. Please listen to all of the answers before you make your selection. Our first question is, what is your number 1 policy priority? Press 1 for climate action, press 2 for guaranteed livable income, press 3 for proportional representation. Again, that question is, what is your number 1 policy priority? Press 1 for climate action, press 2 for guaranteed livable income, press 3 for proportional representation. Our second question is electing more Greens to Parliament important to you? Press 1 for yes, press 2 for no, press 3 for unsure. Again, that question is electing more Greens to Parliament important to you? Press 1 for yes, press 2 for no, press 3 for unsure. And our last question is, do you think the Green Party leader should be fluently bilingual? Press 1 for yes, press 2 for no, press 3 for unsure. Again, that question is, do you think the Green Party leader should be fluently bilingual? Press 1 for yes, press 2 for no, and press 3 for unsure. Thank you for participating in the poll. Now, let's get on to our first question of the night. We have Emily from Alberta asking, what are your top 3 strategies for addressing the climate crisis? David?
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks, Emily, for the question. 3 strategies. First, we need an east-west-north electrical grid that connects up the existing electrical grid. This would be the largest job creation program in Canadian history, bigger than the East-West Continental Railway in the 1800s. And I see that as critical for us to deliver the second part of this strategy, which is the shift to renewable energy. We need to have this grid powered entirely by renewables. We need to move off fossil fuels. This will take time, but we must do this urgently to reduce our greenhouse gas reduction, to meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets. And so I say we need to invest in solar, in geothermal, in wind, in tidal, run-of-river hydro. The renewable energy sector is critical for us getting off fossil fuels. And third, the third element of this strategy would be about social justice. We must make this transition as quickly as we can without leaving anyone behind. And their critical policy elements, the most critical, I believe, is the guaranteed livable income that provides a safety net during this transition and beyond. And no Canadian would have to live in poverty. We'd establish a basic safety net for all. Secondly, free tuition for trade school, college, and university. That as well will enable people to develop the new skills they need in our new economy. So those are the 3 big elements I see in our strategy to address the climate emergency in Canada. And I really hope that if we do this in Canada, we can become an example to the world. We're not an example to the world by any means right now, but by implementing this strategy, we could become that example. Thanks for the question, Emily.
And thanks for sharing your answer, David. I'd like to go to our first live call of the night. So I would like to go to Carla, who's calling in from British Columbia. Carla, are you on the line? You ready to ask your question?
Yes, I'm on the line. David, hi, it's Carla. We know each other. Anyway, the question was, what are your plans for increasing the diversity of the Green Party, which I understand is probably the least diverse of all the major parties?
Hi, Carla. Nice of you to call in. Thanks very much. My plan for increasing the diversity of the Green Party starts at the top. I'm a fan of co-leadership, so 2 leaders, the New Zealand Greens, the German Greens, even the Alberta Greens recently at their convention in December, which I attended, have gone to a co-leadership model. That way you can build in diversity right into the top of the party. Secondly, our federal council, which is a key decision-making body for our whole party, now includes 2 youth members, and I believe we should go beyond that. It's working well with youth. Let's include 2 Indigenous members, people who represent an Indigenous Advisory Council, which I'm going to be setting up for this campaign and which I hope to carry on as leader. And let's go beyond Indigenous communities as well. One of the most marginalized communities is those who are economically marginalized find it very difficult to participate in Canadian politics. So I'm really keen on building this safe space inside the Federal Council to represent people who are now underrepresented, not just in our party, but in Canadian politics. But the most important thing, I really believe this, Carla, is on the ground with each one of our members. We know people who are Indigenous. We know people from the Black community, people of color. We know people who have been economically marginalized. And if each one of us, as Greens, went out and reached out to friends, neighbors, people who are underrepresented in our party, we could really transform our party from the ground up. So I see it as both top down and ground up, and I really put a lot of faith in Greens to bring in this diversity at the grassroots level. Thanks, Carla, for your question.
Thanks, David. That gives us a little more insight into what you believe, and it's really fun to take the first question from someone that knows you already. That never
great.
happens in political debates, does it?
That's great.
I'd like to switch up and go to a question from Anita. She has one around defunding the police. Anita, are you on the line?
I am, yep. Yeah, I would like you to tell us, David, how you would handle the issue that people are generally calling defunding the police, if indeed you would do that. How you would handle that issue.
Anita, I have actually worked with the police. My work was for 28 years. I was in government at the Department of Justice in Ottawa, Privy Council office in Ottawa, and then here in British Columbia, where I am now at the Ministry of Attorney General. And in the last 10 years, I was responsible for working on justice transformation project. How do we transform our justice system so it's more accessible and more fair? And during that time, I was actually able to work with the police specifically on how the police interact with people with mental health issues, addictions issues, and psychotic episodes, and overdose episodes. In Victoria, we have an assertive community treatment team. It works really well. Part of my job was to see how we could expand it across the province. And the police had a really background role. It was the social workers, the psychologists, the nurse practitioners who had relationships with people on the ground. The police were there only to deal with situations of real violence. So the person who would knock on the door would be the social worker or the nurse practitioner. And it's a real model for the way the police need to go. And the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police is endorsing these kinds of models. They're saying, we need to get out of the business of social work. We're not trained for it. We're not good at it. And it's hugely stressful for police. Plus, on the other side, it's not as effective in terms of connecting up with people who are often going through difficult times. So my view is that the defunding or the abolishing the police movement is something that where the language isn't very helpful, it alienates a lot of Canadians, but where the concepts are actually quite right. We need the police out of this business. We need the social workers and psychologists and so on into this business. So I agree with the concept, but I don't think the language is constructive, and I think it actually gets in the way of deep transformational change. I know because that was my work for the last 10 years of my career, and language matters. Thanks, Anita.
Thanks, David. So we'll move on to a question from Glenn from British Columbia.
Hi, David. Thanks for
Glenn?
taking my call.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi. It's no secret that hockey is pretty important to Canadians across Canada. And there's a lot of issues that are currently going on in hockey, a lot of class action lawsuits. And I'm wondering, the current government in power has allowed hockey organizations to lobby the government to circumvent laws that are abusive to children. So what I'm wondering is what you might do differently if you were to come in power as far as protecting child athletes from exploitive conditions and abusive conditions.
Thank you, Glenn, for the question. This is the first time I've been asked that question, and strangely, I know something about it, partly because I'm an avid hockey player. I play 2 or 3 times a week when we don't have COVID-19, and I've been following this issue, including the lobbying of the provincial Liberal government over how the Western Hockey League treated hockey players. And it's a live issue. It's a real question as to whether young hockey players are being paid appropriately, because really in the Western Hockey League, they're on huge schedules, huge travel schedules, very intense. I know the owners on one hand say, well, we're training these young men, and they're all young men right now, to become professional hockey players. They're benefiting enormously from this experience. But on the other hand, the child labor laws, as you mentioned, Glenn, should be applying. These young individuals must be protected, and they are in vulnerable circumstances. And we've seen this with many stories, true stories, of abuse and isolation and bullying, which the Western Hockey League, to its credit, has been taking very seriously. So, Glenn, I believe that we need to make sure that our Western Hockey League teams comply entirely with the labor code, the labor legislation that's in place in BC, and that those young hockey players are protected in a consistent way. Thank you for the question.
Thanks again for the question. And David, will move on to another live caller. It's exciting to have so many people calling into us tonight. I'm trying to do a bit of geographic diversity as well when I'm choosing these. And there's someone from Winnipeg on here. Kevin is there. So are you ready to be able to ask your question, Kevin?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Kevin.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. My question actually is about what are your policies in terms of military spending and the military in general. And the reason I ask this is because I feel like a lot of Canadians, unfortunately, are kind of not aware of a really important part of the Department of National Defence, which is the Canadian Cadet program for youth, which impacts so many young Canadians.
Kevin, that's a fantastic question. I have 4 daughters, and many of them have friends in school who are in the cadet program, and I agree, it's a really important program. And I know the military believe it's a very important program. Just a short story, I won't go on too long because we want to get as many questions in as possible, but we had a Young Green program in my riding in 2019 for the 2019 election, Kevin. We brought in 30 Young Greens from across Canada. And one of the things we did is we actually had a chance to talk to the base commander. There's a huge naval base in my riding, Esquimalt-Saint-Nicolas, and we had a chance to ask him questions. And he was saying the biggest challenge for the military right now is recruitment. It's critical for them. And they're really counting on the cadet program. It's something that I support entirely. And to answer your question more generally, I really believe that many, many military people, especially military people under 40, are actually Greens. My father and I knocked on hundreds of doors on that base, and we were amazed. People want a green future, and they see that the Canadian military right now is dealing with huge environmental issues. They're fighting forest fires in BC and Alberta. They're fighting floods in Quebec and New Brunswick. They're dealing with the pandemic in seniors' homes in Quebec and Ontario, right? This is the life of the military now. And you know what? They actually love being able to help Canadians. It's one of the things that makes them really proud to be in the military. But they're saying they need the right equipment and they need the right training. And so that's the direction I would be pushing for as a member of parliament, or if we hold a balance of power in Ottawa with, let's say, 15 or 20 Greens after the next election, we should be putting pressure on our politicians to make sure that our troops are properly equipped. And I'm not a big spender. Like, I would say cut the F-35 program entirely. It's a total waste of money. We don't need an offensive fighter jet. So I'm not about spending more on the military, but I am about shifting the direction of the military to dealing with the number one crisis in Canada today, which is the climate emergency. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, David. And thanks to Kevin for your question. That was an interesting one to be able to answer for sure. Let's go up to one that's a little controversial, and we'll go to Stacy in Victoria. Stacy?
I just had my phone on mute. I was wondering, with regards to the climate emergency, what your views are on what direction we should take with agricultural subsidies. Right now, the balance is heavily in favor of animal agriculture, which we know is worsening the climate emergency.
Totally agree, Stacey. Our subsidies are set up to help and to really help industrial scale agriculture. And the Green Party has long campaigned for moving to much more local scale agricultural, moving off the industrial scale feedlots and moving on to the local production of meat products, but also shifting our diet entirely off meat and onto more vegetarian and vegan diet. The Canada Food Guide is something that we support very much as a Green Party. And the Canada Food Guide itself is saying that we need to reduce more of our consumption of dairy. We need to get off dairy. And as you know, dairy is a huge producer of methane gas, the dairy industry. So I think the Green Party is taking this seriously. We're going to be rolling out a new website, Stacey, in the next week or so. And one of the issues on there is a strong agricultural policy that really supports the idea of moving off industrial scale agriculture, moving off meat and onto more of a vegetarian, vegan type diet, consistent with the Canada Food Guide. Thanks for the question.
Wonderful, and a nice contextual answer, David. We appreciate both the question and the answer there. So let's move on to let's go for Bruce from Athabasca.
Hi, Bruce. Welcome.
Good evening. Good evening. It's Bruce here, David. And I'm calling with regards to the recently set up Canadian Infrastructure Bank. It's been set up and it's designed to help anybody wanting to work on the infrastructure deficit in this country. But there's a problem with it in that the way it's currently set up and funded is that they're getting where they get their money to begin with comes from the multi-billionaire money fund. And they get paid 4.5% for their money first. Then it gets lent out to whoever wants to work on it. Would you figure out a way for the Bank of Canada to produce that money, or what would you do to address that issue of giving the billionaires the money first?
Great question, because the Bank of Canada has huge scope in its charter to be funding these types of projects. And I'm glad you raised this. The Trudeau government has created two crown corporations essentially to build infrastructure, and it's very focused on infrastructure related to the fossil fuel industry. One of them is the crown corporation that now holds the assets for the TMX pipeline, the Kinder Morgan pipeline. The other one is the Infrastructure Bank, as you mentioned. And if we cannot figure out how to enable the Bank of Canada to be the primary funder of Canadian infrastructure, then we're failing. The economists are all saying that Canada has huge scope also to increase public debt. Our debt to GDP ratio is very low compared to the United States, Japan, European Union. So we can actually fund this internally, and we should. Thank you for the question.
And thanks again, David. So let's move on to a question from Richard. He's talking about overpopulation. Richard, are you there?
Hello, David. My question is really quite simple. When we had Dimitri here in Salmon Arm, he told us that not only did he want to grow the population as fast as the Liberals, i.e. 2% a year, he wanted to do it faster. A lot of people have flunked math, apparently. My question is, how do we double our population in, say, 30 years and still reduce our carbon footprint?
Thank you for the question, Richard, from Salmon Arm. That's great. The key is consumption. It would only be possible to do that, Richard, if we were also cutting consumption, because Canada already consumes way more than its fair share in terms of emissions of carbon emissions, in terms of our consumption of meat and dairy products, in terms of our consumption of fossil fuels. We would need a fundamental transformation in how our economy works, how consumers consume. And so I am sorry to say this to you, Richard, but I actually believe we do need to increase our population. I think the Liberals are roughly on track especially in terms of opening our borders to refugees. Climate refugees are going to be a huge source of instability globally, and I think Canada has always stepped up and played a role in terms of opening our doors to refugees. And then on immigration, I think that we need to do our part as well. But the truth is, and this is a core part of your question, Richard, I know, if we bring in people who are coming from countries that are low consumers of fossil fuels and we bring them to Canada, what we're doing is immediately shifting into making the climate emergency worse than it currently is. So Canada needs to get its act together right away in terms of how we consume and how we save and how we get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Thank you for the question.
And thanks again, David. I'm starting to understand why talk show hosts have all of these little bitty things that they have in the middle of being able to say things just to be able to make it sound interesting when you're pivoting between questions and trying to keep it going. So,
luckily, we don't have any advertising here, Victoria, so that's good.
Yeah. And it's wonderful. We have so many questions coming in that I just want to keep going on them, and I forget that I also need to be a human being and connect a little with people in between.
Yeah.
But here we go.
And I'll try and be brief as well. I'll try and shorten my answers.
So there's a question from Cheryl calling in. It's Cheryl, and she's talking about carbon sinks. Cheryl, can you go ahead?
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question. I'm Cheryl McCumsey. I live in Powell River. And it's actually something that people don't think about a whole lot, that our carbon sinks are now carbon emitters, that being forestry. And although it's often controlled by provincial governments, I have right now a federal petition online to stop herbicide spraying in all our forests because the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, which is the agency under Health Canada, decides the uses of all pesticides, which, by the way, we've increased by 40% in the last 5 years in general. But in forestry, we take out the very trees, the deciduous trees that are carbon sinks by about 800% more than other trees. They're also fire resistant, stop the spread of forest fires. And also, you might have heard Paul Manley giving an interview recently about old growth forests. So my question is, how will you protect our forests from more abuses coming from the forestry industry in regards to wiping out old growth forests, taking away jobs as well, because we are not diversifying in this industry. We're just sending this out of our country and really raping the land, the water, the fish. Our forests in general have become monocultures. So I could talk on and on, as you can see. But I'm focused on the herbicide spraying. There's probably tens of thousands of people in every single province who are opposed to this. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, BC. There's 112,000 signatures from Prince George alone in regards to this issue on one petition. So it's a huge issue. And it's not talked about half enough, because if we don't have carbon sinks, it's not going to help us to transition from oil and gas.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheryl. David, would you like to be able to answer that?
Yeah, Cheryl, there were a lot of elements there. I think your key point was around spraying. And actually, Judy, who's on this call, was just at a protest last week on spraying in Nova Scotia. And I know that Elizabeth May, as a teenager, started the fight in Nova Scotia against spruce budworm spraying. And so it's been a big part of our history and our current fight inside the Green Party for a stop to this kind of really pollution of our forests. And so this is a great part of the Green Party culture, something clearly I support. You also mentioned the old growth logging, and I know you know this, but I don't know how many people across Canada know that more old growth forests are being logged today under the NDP on Vancouver Island than under the Liberals. And the Liberals were really very conservative, very much behind the forestry industry. But as was said in the question, it's really an industry of cut and export. Very, very little development on Vancouver Island or in British Columbia, little use of this very precious and disappearing resource. So we need to transform the way our forestry practices are conducted here in British Columbia. We need to look at the best practices around the world, like in Finland, for example, where they pay very close attention to how they're growing as much as they're cutting, and then when they cut, how they use their product to generate jobs. And I think we need a real shift in our mindset, and the question you ask is a critical one for our forestry industry.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, David. That was a good, complex question. And I'm, as a climate change educator, I'm really glad always to talk about things like carbon sinks.
Yeah.
So
one of the things I should have said, because I didn't say it about the carbon sink, is also building our carbon sinks. We campaigned in 2019 on a massive tree planting program, and in our riding in Esquimalt, Sanish-Suk, we took a day during the National Forest Day, actually, and planted trees in one of our public parks. And it was one of the best days on the campaign. So I'm a real fan of tree planting. One last thing, we're going to offset the carbon impacts of our whole leadership campaign through a tree planting project. If I'm leader, it'll be all across Canada, in every province of Canada. If I'm not leader, it'll be in my own riding in Esquimalt, Sanish-Suk. I'm so glad you mentioned the carbon sink aspect, because I haven't addressed that, but tree planting is a huge part of creating new carbon sinks. Thanks, Victoria.
Yeah, tree planting is another thing I've done a lot of, and it's so important all across Canada and in areas where where it makes sense, of course. There's a really interesting question from Dawn, who wants to ask a question about the Green New Deal. So, Dawn, would you like to go ahead?
I'm Don, but my question wasn't about the Green New Deal.
Go ahead,
is your
Don.
question about animal consumption of animal?
No. Mine was a citizenship question. So if you're ready, I can ask you.
Go for it.
Somewhere between 1 and 2 million people have been denied or stripped of their Canadian citizenship over the years, and that's the issue called Lost Canadians. And right now, Canada is violating 3 United Nations human rights conventions, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Minor-age children of Canadian citizens are being denied the right to come to Canada and live with their parents, or if they get here, they're denied the right to go to school or get health care. Canada is the leading country at making their own people stateless, and it particularly affects the Indigenous people. And finally, women have less rights in citizenship legislation than men. The job of all politicians is to stand up for the rights of Canadian citizens and to try to make life better for them. Will you make equal rights in citizenship legislation and Lost Canadians a top priority of the party?
Yes, Don, and I think you sent me an email on this, and I really appreciate the background that you provided, and the answer is yes. We need to make sure that our practices, our citizenship practices, are completely consistent with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 15 guarantees equality rights, and as you've said, Canada has a very mixed record on this, and it's something that we should fix by legislation. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, David. And we'll move on live to Sandy, who's calling in from Surrey. Sandy, are you there?
Can you hear us, Sandy? We're ready for your question.
You may need to unmute.
Not sure if Sandy can hear us or if we can't hear her. One or the other. How about if you read us the question off our list there, Victoria, while we figure that out? Does that work?
Sure. Sandy was wondering how we're going to pass the message on to young people, because getting young people engaged and explaining it to them will make a difference.
Yeah, I love that question, because I really believe that we need to be able to reach out to young people. And in my experience, it's much more effective to have young people reaching out to young people. One of the things I did in the 2019 campaign was organize a program in our riding, or actually enable young people to organize their own program in our riding. They called it Paint the Island Green. We brought 30 young people from across Canada to Esquimalt, Sanish-Suk. We provided them with a billet. We provided them with food at our campaign office. They taught us a lot about social media. We taught them probably a little about door knocking and phoning. And we had the best campaign, partly because of these 30 really fantastic young Greens. And they were very effective at reaching out to other young people in our riding, actually on all of South Vancouver Island. They attended all the climate strikes, and they really created, I think, friendships which will last for years. And so I'm a real believer that as we build a movement of movements that connects up with Black Lives Matter and Idle No More, we really need to focus on how do we reach out to young people and bring them over to us. Right now, we're in serious competition with the NDP for the youth vote, and I think we have leaders in this leadership race. The 8 candidates here represent the full diversity of Canada, almost the full diversity of Canada. Certainly geographically, it's been wonderful. So let's use that team, this team of rivals. Let's bring them together and get them involved in reaching out to young people and beyond to create this movement of movements led by the Green Party of Canada. Thanks for the question.
Great. Thanks, David. Let's move on to Jeremy, who is here live to ask a question. Jeremy?
Looking at a snap election this fall, as you know, and it occurs to me that we might be facing election days after you're elected party leader. So just want to get a sense of what your thoughts are about a potential election and how you might, what the strategy might be for the party moving into it.
Starting in terms of me personally, I've been traveling across the country pretty much, apart from a COVID-19 break between March and July. I've really made an effort to reach out to communities on the ground. I'm on the final steps of a BC tour. Last week I went through Quebec, you know, from Gatineau to Oka to Montreal to Mont-Saint-Joli to Quebec City to Chicoutimi to Trois-Rivières. And that's really what a federal campaign looks like. So I really believe that I would just continue rolling. I've had my spring training and then it'll be this full season if we roll straight into a federal election. So at the personal level, I'm ready. I'm concerned, though, that at the national level, the party really needs to start nominating our candidates early. If we don't have a fall election, and by the way, Jeremy, I think with COVID-19, it would be really irresponsible for the government to launch an election. For the Liberals to create that opportunity for Canadians would be, or that risk, I should say, for Canadians is a real problem. But nationally, we need to be ready. We need to start nominating candidates as soon as we possibly can. And we also need to get our messaging very clear. One of our problems in the 2019 campaign was we did not have clear, simple, compelling messaging. And my first answer, I think, relates to this. We need to talk about the largest job creation strategy in Canadian history and how we're going to move off renewables and onto fossil fuels. We need to talk about leaving no one behind. If we have a very positive, focused, clear message, I think that we'll be able to do really well in the next election. One of the great things about the Green Party, one of our best strengths, is our frontline volunteers. And if our frontline volunteers are empowered, if our EDAs have candidates ready to go and rolling, I really have a lot of faith in the Green Party and being able to roll into the next election quickly and effectively. But it's going to require the right kind of leadership where we can campaign in both official languages and win seats in Quebec and New Brunswick, and then across the whole country. So thanks for the question, Jeremy. We have a big challenge ahead of us if there's a fall election.
Yes, we do. Thanks, David. How about we move on to a question from Sally? This is one of your favorite types. Sally?
We can't hear you, Sally. You might be on mute. Yeah, go ahead. We can hear you now.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I just wondered that if other people in the government wanted to do something that was against our principles, then would you go for it or not?
No, thank you, Sally. The answer is no. Our party has always been a party that has been focused on ethics, on integrity, and on our 6 core values. And we can't go for anything that's not consistent with those things. We want to be the party of integrity and ethics and values. And I feel very deeply that we must hold ourselves to the highest possible standards. And if we fail to do that, then we become just like the other parties. And we were talking about the NDP here in BC, where they campaign on environmental program, and then they did the opposite in terms of old growth and fish farms and the Site C Dam. And we've seen that with the Liberals as well. They say one thing during campaigns and pretty much have done the opposite since 2015, especially on democratic reform. They broke that promise within the first 6 months. On their environmental agenda, they basically adopted Stephen Harper's greenhouse gas reduction targets, and then they failed to meet even those low targets. So it's really important for the Greens not to be like the same old politicians that have dominated Canadian politics. And I think Canadians are tired of that, and they're looking for a real alternative. And it's really important for us to live by our values.
And as the values officer of your campaign, I agree.
I'm pretty sure we're the only campaign that has a chief values officer, and everybody gets to see and hear Victoria here. She's our chief values officer. She's the chair of all our meetings, and she makes sure that everybody, including the candidate, really sticks to green values. And we, at almost every staff meeting, we have a conversation about how important that is to our leadership campaign, but also to our party.
Thanks, David.
Thanks for the reminder, Victoria.
So I'd like to go to a question from Candace about something that's important to your heart. Candace?
Hello?
Hi, Candace.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi there. So my question is, how would you see that UNDRIP is actually fully implemented in this country? And the atrocities that have been laid on our Indigenous peoples for eons of time, how are you going to address that there still isn't clean water on our reservations, and that our First Nations people, all our Indigenous peoples, are struggling under this terrible colonial yoke where they're not even getting proper education and health care?
Thank you for your question, Candace. One of the reasons I went into law is exactly what you said, is that we are a country that has inflicted deep injustice on Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. And I believe that by going into law, learning how to be a litigator, learning how to work with legislation, I'd be able to help to address some of those injustices. My first job in law was on a reserve in Alberta with a lawyer named Willie Littlechild, and we worked on submissions to the United Nations Human Rights Committee in Geneva, fighting for Indigenous justice. And your question on UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is excellent. We need legislation to implement that. And your question on water is right on too. This Trudeau government has made huge commitments on delivering clean drinking water to reserves, and it's another one of those things where they have completely failed to deliver. In fairness, they have put in a lot of money into it, but we still have hundreds of First Nations across Canada that are struggling with polluted water and living under boil water advisories. To me, this is a priority. It's a priority on my campaign. In the next week, I'll be announcing a leadership advisory circle of 4 Indigenous people who have agreed to review all our policies in our leadership campaign. And if I'm leader, I'm going to ask them to continue to serve on the circle so that every policy that we bring in, I get briefed on by the Indigenous Advisory Circle, and that I have a chance to provide a viewpoint from Indigenous people at the most senior levels of our party and our shadow cabinet and our federal council. I see this as a real personal priority for me, and I believe that many Greens care very deeply about this issue too. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you, David. So we're going to move on to William, and he is live from Skeena District.
Yes, hello.
Hi, William.
How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you for coming on.
Okay, I have just one question to ask you that's very important. But before I do that, I would like to ask you, sir, are you the leader of the party, or are you just representing like a district?
I'm running to become the leader of the party. Elizabeth May retired. I'm a candidate.
Because I just got into I just joined the Green Party last election because I was really, really fed up with all 3 parties. As a matter of fact, I was disgusted. And one of the main reasons I wanted to ask you, sir, you want to become the leader of the party. Are you fully, do you speak French and English?
Thank you very much for that question, because it's a crucial question, and I believe it's essential for our leader on day one to be able to speak both French and English. I did my bar admission course in Ontario in French. I litigated as a lawyer in courts and tribunals in Quebec and Ontario when I worked at the Department of Justice in Ottawa. But more importantly than that, sir, I played hockey on French teams. And usually I was the only English speaker on those teams. I'm not the best hockey player. I'm very enthusiastic, though. But when you're not the best hockey player and you're the only English-speaking person on the team, you learn a lot of good French terminology. And so I can speak hockey French, too. And for winning votes in New Brunswick or Quebec or Eastern Ontario, that hockey French is the key. And I've done it. I campaigned in those places. I campaigned for Megan Mitten in New Brunswick. A lot of Francophones there. The reason we won was our door knocking, and she won by 11 votes. The New Brunswick Greens are in an election now, and I think they're going to do even better than the 3 seats they got last time. So thanks for your question. Yes, I am fully bilingual, and I'm very, very committed to having a bilingual party. Thank you. And welcome to the party, by the way. It's great to have new people coming in.
Yes, definitely. So I'm going to move on to a question from Don, because we've only got a short amount of time left. So Don, would you like to go ahead with yours? He's from Yellowhead County.
Hello.
Hi, Don.
Can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I'm from rural Alberta. And I'll try and keep my question brief for you. Basically, to hear what you would do to sell the Green New Deal to people in rural Alberta who presently work in the fossil fuel industry, and there's a lot of them around me. So
Don, I love that question. I thank you very much. I have a lot of family in rural Alberta. I was born in Edmonton, but much of my family is in Wetaskiwin and outside Wetaskiwin. Last month, I had breakfast with a cousin of mine who lives in a rural area right outside Wetaskiwin. He's actually a welder on the Kinder Morgan pipeline, on TMX pipeline, and we discussed exactly his concerns. And the first thing he said to me is, David, I'm so glad you're not wearing sandals and tie-dye, because often the Alberta conservatives, he's quite conservative, have this view of how Greens dress here in British Columbia. But we had a serious discussion, and he said to me, if he could get out of welding on pipelines, it's hot in the summer, cold in the winter, and if he could have a different future for his kids, he would be the first person to support a transition. And I believe we can sell the just transition. I believe we can sell the Green New Deal you mentioned. I really believe even people in the fossil fuel industry in Alberta want to see a different future for their kids. And welders like my cousin, you can weld solar panels. You can weld on geothermal projects. Hinton, Alberta is leading Canada on geothermal. Southern Alberta has wind farms everywhere. Wind power is critical in Southern Alberta. It's the best place in Canada, actually, for wind power. The town of Raymond, Alberta, has gone entirely solar in its municipal infrastructure. So Alberta is actually a really good example of how you can already start to make the transition. But what we need for folks like my cousin is we need a guaranteed annual income so he knows his income isn't going to fall below a certain level. And he also needs to be retrained. He needs to be able to go to the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology or to Southern Alberta Institute of Technology and learn the welding skills or other skills that he needs to get onto the renewable energy sector. And then for his kids, I say rural internet connectivity, connecting up his kids to the global economy so they can actually still stay on the farm, still stay on the farm property, live there if they want to, and many do. Many would prefer not to travel into Calgary or Edmonton or even leave the province. So let's make it possible for people to connect up to the global economy from where they are. The pandemic has proven we can do it. It just takes infrastructure and political will, and that's what the Greens provide, is the political will to make this transition happen. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, David. And now we're going to move on to Scott. He's calling in from Vancouver Island.
Hello.
Hi, Scott.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi.
you can.
I guess I might be the last guy. I'll try to make this quick. So yeah, I joined the party maybe 2 years ago, just before the Greens took Nanaimo, and I was pretty happy with the candidate. So that's why I switched. I used to be an NDP voter. Before that, I was a Conservative voter, and I just wanted to say that in the last little while, in a lot of the messaging I've been receiving by email in the mail from various candidates, I've honestly been a little disillusioned with the party. I find that they're navel-gazing a lot on issues of like diversity and equity and colonialism and all these issues that are not related to environmentalism, which really just do more to alienate voters in the center or on the right. And you were speaking about members of the Canadian Forces and being Green members. Well, yeah, I do remember. I was actually in the Forces for about 12 years. And in the Esquimalt area, there are a lot of people who would believe like you and me politically. But I spent a lot of time in the prairie, completely different. And I just wanted to know, with the policies that the Green Party is putting forward publicly, do you feel at all like we may be alienating people that we might want to be capturing from down the middle or from the right? Because if we're just going after this Unite the Progressive strategy, you could capture all the NDP seats and we're still not going to win an election. So what is the goal in actually winning a federal election, or is the goal to win a federal election?
Yeah, I love that question because I think the answer to that has to be yes. We need to build to get to that point. And the way we build, I totally agree with the premise of your question, is not by adopting a narrow ideology like, say, eco-socialism or socialism. And it's not by pursuing a narrow identity politics. It's about one of our core values, which is diversity. We need to really respect the full diversity of Canada, all the identities. We need to be respectful of the full diversity of opinion in Canada. So not just eco-socialism or socialism. And we need to really be a party that's credible to Canadians. If we're not credible, we're not going to win seats. And I agree with the premise of your question. We need to be inclusive. By the way, I campaigned on Paul Manley's campaign as well. We went up there 6 times from Esquimalt with a van load or 2 van loads or carloads of people. Just before Election Day, we brought a whole bunch of people who stayed for 4 days to do door knocking. And I don't know if you were at the celebration there, but that was quite the celebration on that by-election election night. And so that's another thing that Greens have to do is we have to pool our resources and work together on the ground. We need to be better organized on the ground. And we can't spend our time, as you suggested in your question, talking about, racists in New Brunswick or separatists in Quebec or whether we're a pro-choice party or not. That's what happened in the 2019 campaign. We got way off track from the key message, which is we're facing a climate emergency and we have the best practical, positive solutions for Canadians. We need to switch our message into a positive message of solutions, of practicality, and of credibility. And if we can do that, if we can make that switch, we can win way more seats. So I totally agree with what you're saying. To do that, though, we need a leader who's credible, a leader who's a uniter, somebody who will bring together the various different factions in this leadership race and can unite us all around a common message. I sincerely believe, and this is my last part, is that I'm the only person who can do that in this race. If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't be running. Thank you.
Okay,
bit of a long answer there. Sorry, Victoria. I got to shorten the answer.
I know you love being able to discuss these things. So we're going to go to one more question, and then I believe that we're going to move into the closing part. So we've got Nancy on the line who is calling in. Nancy, are you there?
Hi, Nancy.
Hello?
You might be on. Hi, we can hear you now.
Yes, my question is, what can you do to save our wild Pacific salmon and get rid of the fish farms that should have been transitioned to closed containment years ago?
I totally agree with that solution, Nancy, and that's exactly what the federal government should be doing by legislation. They should be legislating that fish farms must come out of the water entirely. We cannot continue with the terrible impacts of our fish farms on wild salmon in British Columbia. And the evidence from Washington State is clear. Get the fish farms out of the water, and it has a real impact on fish stocks. The Cohen Commission has come up with a whole series of recommendations which have not been implemented. That should be a top priority. And Nancy, your question is absolutely right. It does look like we are facing a potential collapse of the entire salmon fishery on the west coast of Canada, just like we had a collapse of the cod fishery on the east coast. It would be a disaster, and we need action now.
Okay, thank you, David. There have been a lot of great questions and conversation tonight. And David, based on what you've heard so far, what's your impression of the input from participants on tonight's virtual town hall?
I think it's fantastic. We had several questions that I haven't been asked yet in the leadership campaign, and that's very unusual. I'm doing Zoom calls, 4 or 5 every week. And so it was just great to get questions we hadn't been asked before. And I really appreciate all the people that called in. It's great to see hundreds of people calling in, listening, participating. I really hope that everybody will reach out to their fellow Greens across Canada and remind them there are so many people who either don't know there's a vote on or don't know that the vote starts on September 26th. And so please reach out to your friends, neighbors, anybody who you know is a Green Party member. We need to get the word out, and it's so great that people have called in. We're going to have a call every Wednesday for the next 2 weeks. So across Canada, the next one on next Wednesday is entirely in French. So please call in again if people want to call in.
Okay, so thank you for everyone with the questions. We're really sorry that we're not able to get to all of them. We've done our best to try to have a diversity of questions, and we would like to be able to still hear the questions. So we would encourage people to go to the website and send an email to David. You have more to say on that, David?
Yes, go to davidmerner.com and send us in any questions you have. I'd love to get feedback from you on this if you have any suggestions. And also, if you have a sense of how you're going to rate me on the preferential ballot, especially if you're going to rate me number 1, let me know. I'd love to get the feedback. Or if it's number 3 or number 8, let me know. I'd be interested. Thank you again for everybody. Over to you, Victoria. Thanks for letting me jump in again. I think you're on mute, Victoria.
Is there anything else you would like to say before I read the final bit for everybody?
That's it. Thank you.
Thanks again. So again, thank you to everybody. We have a lot that's happening now between now and the voting day. So go to davidmerner.com to sign up for our newsletter and keep up to date. And thanks again for everybody that's participating. As I mentioned earlier, if you have a comment or a question that we didn't get to tonight, please stay on the phone after the event has ended, and you'll be able to leave us a voicemail. Thanks, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Victoria. Great job.